Welcome, everybody. Happy Friday. It's Tom Noser and Shannon Hooper today. And we're going to be talking to you about character and your life. So, light topic for a Friday morning. I can't tell you how pleased I am to have Shannon with me. I'm going to introduce her in just a little bit. But let's go ahead and begin the program. So, let me pull up our slides. So while I'm fumbling, if you all can send us a chat about why you came and what you hope you want to learn. So want to make sure that you take away from this hour something valuable for you. So if you can let us know what you're interested in, why you came, what you hope you want to learn. So for instance, you might have come just because you love Shannon and you know she's an amazing person. And so if that's the case, go ahead and send us that note. If there's something you want to learn, maybe you want to understand how Shannon became a chief product officer and chief strategy officer, how she helped grow Revive Health and make it an enormously successful company, helping healthcare providers spread the good word about their services. Let us know that. We'll be sure to cover those questions as well. Or if you want to understand what Shannon's doing today in using virtual reality technology to bring behavioral health innovations, so new treatments that use VR to help in behavioral health. It's really interesting stuff, worth an hour on its own. But welcome to Build the Life You Want by Managing Your Character Like a Product. So Heraclitus, the obscure, once said about 500 years before the birth of Christ that character is destiny. So what did he mean by that? Who you are shapes what you become and what happens to you. So we can ask, is that true? And if it is there anything that we can do about it? Can we shape our characters to help shape our destiny? And so I brought along an expert in both character and destiny, Shannon Hooper. Shannon, tell folks a little bit about your background and in your interest in Stoicism and philosophy.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it is a delight to be here. Thank you for having me, Tom. It's always really good to have conversations with you. Yeah, my background on the professional front has been almost a couple decades in the healthcare field, a lot in the digital health and innovation space, which I'm happy to talk about a little bit more, and now serving as Chief Strategy and Product Officer at Behavior, which, as you mentioned, Tom, is a digital therapeutics company focused on virtual reality solutions for behavioral health. But there's a lot of other things I think that kind of shape my life. I've been a long time student of Stoicism. A lot of, I think, what we'll talk about today touches on many of those concepts, so we'll dig in more there. And I'm just kind of a curious person. So I think I have a bit of an obsession with being exposed to new things, new people, new ideas, new concepts, new experiences. And a lot of that probably pops up in other aspects here on the screen, from majoring in religion, which a lot of people are very curious about, all the way to random side projects I do in crypto startup school, and my love of travel and just reading. And I think just one thing, which we'll get into more, I'm very much a believer of this idea that I am my own product. My character is the only thing that I can control. So trying to be really deliberate about shaping that in many ways is pretty core to who I am.
Thank you, Shannon. A little bit about me. I came to Nashville to write the great American novel as an English major at Vanderbilt, and the novel wasn't very good. But I discovered teaching while I was there. I began tutoring varsity athletes at Vandy early in my marriage, and then went to school to get my master's in education, taught ninth grade English. They beat the heck out of me. And then got involved in education research. And that's really been the foundation of my career. I've always thought about myself as a teacher. I have 3 grown kids, a wonderful wife, and that's the co-founder of the business there in my arms, Margaret the Pug, who I hope to make more famous than me one day. You want to tell us a little bit about Marcus?
Yeah, absolutely. So This is one of my favorite quotations from Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. So, the things you think about determine the quality of your mind. Your soul takes on the color of your thoughts. And in addition to this being just what I think is a rather beautiful evocative concept, the whole idea here is it's within our power to shape how we see and interact with the world, and kind of our mind and our consciousness and our virtue, like ultimately our character. That's all we really have. And so the simplest step we can take to improving ourselves and the lives of people around us is to actually focus our thoughts and thereby our actions on positive things. So I think this will maybe set up some of what we're going to talk about today, but it's just always really rung true to me.
You want to tell us a little bit, Shannon, about why we think this is important?
Yeah, so I think this connects a little bit to that concept from Marcus Aurelius. So what this basically shows is that as people on average get older, they spend much more time alone by themselves, which is not such a shocking concept, but you look at it and it's a rather dramatic kind of steep incline. And so in that context, I think that improving our minds and our relationship with ourselves is maybe the most important thing that we can do, not just because it leads to what I believe is a very positive element of change in the world, but because over time, ourself is the person we spend the most time with. And so kind of this aspect of curating one's own character so that you can love yourself and be able to have that kind of a comfort is probably the most important thing you can do to create a happy life. But that's kind of what I see when I see this. What about you?
Yeah, the biggest relationship I'll ever have in my life is with myself. I can't get away from me. And so I have to be comfortable in that relationship. And as you said, over time, so I'm in this range in here, closer to that. And my amount of time alone is going up and up. My kids are out of the house. My wife has a full-time job. My folks live in New Jersey. So I have to be comfortable in that space. And that's really where character is revealed.
Mhm.
So I want to encourage you, like when you were a kid, so I'm going to encourage the audience to think a little bit about what you always wanted to be. So just pause for a second and think about, when I was a kid, what did I want to be? Now I'm going to tell you that that's the wrong way to approach it. That it's not about what you are, but it's who you are. And so, Shannon, tell us about someone who was an influence on your life.
Yeah, so I grew up probably as a dual tomboy and bookworm, and I kind of accomplished that dual feat by spending a lot of time climbing trees and then sitting in those trees and reading a lot of books. So I've always been a bit of an introvert, always been very comfortable being alone, and a lot of my role models actually came out of books and kind of in terms of who and what I want to be. So the thing that sticks out for me is probably my earliest role model was from a book my mom gave me called Juniper by Monica Furlong. And if anyone who's listening to this has kids, I don't know, especially daughters in the range of 7 to 11 years old, I really recommend this book because it's the story of a wealthy child who chooses to cast away her fortune, put herself through a year of abstinence away from worldly goods in order to kind of train and elevate her mind. And, ultimately, since it's the children's book, obviously saves the kingdom in the end. But for me, it was actually the first introduction to this concept, which is deep in Stoicism, of the obstacle is the way. And this idea of embracing difficulty with both physical and mental pain to achieve something much bigger has always stayed with me. And so kind of as I was growing up, I really thought about Juniper as this type of person I wanted to be capable of being, to choose the difficult thing because of something bigger that would be on the other side of it. So that's what sticks out for me.
That's awesome. Yeah, I think I love that concept of the obstacle is the way. So, I have experience in recovery, and that is kind of what you have, where it starts from, is admitting that you need to recover. Mm-hmm. And then going into that reality of no longer denying that this is an issue in your life, but that you have to embrace that. So it plays out there as well. For me, it was I grew up in an entrepreneurial family, and I have always had a desire to be an artist. I wanted to be a writer or to make movies, etc. But um, my father is a very impressive character for me, and he had a successful business when I was a little kid, and at an early age in his 40s. So I remember being in kindergarten and people would say, "What do you want to be?" And I wanted to be an artist, but that wasn't really acceptable in the household that I grew up in. So I heard this term commercial artist. So I used to tell people, in kindergarten, "What do you want to be?" "I want to be a commercial artist," because that was acceptable. Well, it was totally wrong. I can't draw at all. I have no visual sense. I'm an author. But this concept of what it was that I wanted to be, because this was acceptable within the household that I was in, and it was acceptable in my own mind of what I thought I could be, but I didn't pick a who, I picked the what, and I actually think that's a big mistake. So our lives can take many, many different paths. We have a tremendous number of options in front of us. And I think having someone in mind who is your inspiration about who you want to be can be extremely beneficial. So for me, Edward Tufte is a role model. And so I can look at his life and see someone who is an academic. He is a teacher. He's an artist. He publishes his own books, and say, wow, that's really a model that I'm interested in. Or Sam Harris. Sam Harris is an author. He's a podcaster. He's a public intellectual. And so I can be drawn to something like that and say, yes, that is something like what I want. But I only know these people from their outside. I have no idea what their character really is. And for many of us, even our own characters are mysteries to ourselves. So what tools do we have to be able to get past brand and to character? So what is brand? Brand is that public face that we show the world. It's the image we're trying to create about who we are, but it is not real. Character is what's real. Character, like this, like what you do when no one is what you're doing when no one is looking, or what people are going to say about you after you're dead. So on the previous page, there were many famous people. And we can look at those people and say, wow, what accomplishments they had. But we don't really know, because we don't know what people thought about them at their funeral, who knew them, who loved them. Were they thinking, well, thank God that's over? Or were they thinking about how much they were going to miss that person? We don't really know. And so that is critical to understand that about yourself. So what tools do you have to be able to uncover and understand your own character, and then to shape that so you can achieve the life that you want, which may have something to do with those external elements of brand. You may have a car you want to buy. You may have a house you want to live in. You may have a partner who you want to attract. But all of those are trappings. They're circumstances. They aren't the real thing. So these 12 steps help you understand what the real thing really is. It helps you begin to uncover who you are, what your character is. And it also tries to encourage you to have a positive character. Leadership is about the accumulation of power. And you can use that power for good or for ill. But leadership by itself does not mean doing good in the world. It simply means you have the power to make choices and to influence what happens to other people. And that can be good or it can be bad. Your character is what's going to determine which of those paths you choose. So Shannon, we've looked at this list together before. Is there anything here in your career, over your personal life, that stands out where you say, yes, this was useful to me in my development?
Yeah, I think there's actually a lot of useful things on this list. The one that sticks out to me is the first one: identify what you can and can't control. And I warned everyone that I was going to talk a lot about stoicism on this conversation, but that really is essentially the crux of the idea of stoicism. And I did jot down one of my favorite pieces of writing from Epictetus, who's one of the kind of originators of Stoic thought, who says, the chief task in life is simply this: to identify and separate matters so that I can say clearly to myself which are externals not under my control and which have to do with the choices I can actually control. Where then do I look for good and evil? Not to uncontrollable externals, but within myself to the choices that are my own. And so I think that concept is really, really powerful. It's also difficult, right? It's difficult to truly think about what is within and outside of your control. And some of it's also connected to a lot of the virtues, because someone could decide all this stuff is out of my control, so I'm not going to worry about that and kind of take a defeatist stance. But if you actually truly analyze what are the things that you can change, what aspects of yourself can you shift, what parts of the world can you impact, there are many, many things that you have the ability to shape and do. And then identifying what those are and acting on them is incredibly important to being able to grow as a person and a leader.
That's fantastic. I love that quote. Um,
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit more about Epictetus and what other tools you've gotten from him and from Stoicism in general.
Yeah, so I think kind of that's one core aspect, the idea of what's within and outside of your control. Connected to that is an element of being truly present in the
Mhm.
moment. So not spending a lot of time thinking about something that's already happened or anticipating a potential future, kind of recognizing what is in that moment, appreciating it, loving it, kind of loving in, loving yourself in that, and then determining what are the actions that I can be doing right now that are going to make the greatest impact for me and for others. That's another concept. I also think there's in Stoicism, and I believe this came from Epictetus, although it might have been from Seneca, but this idea of listening and being truly deeply curious. There's this concept of you have two ears and one mouth, use them proportionally. And so I think kind of that idea runs deep in Stoicism as well, making sure that, even as you're kind of understanding yourself and what your actions are, being extremely responsive to other people and kind of having empathy for others, and learning from that to be able to act on it and make the world a better place. So I think all of that's kind of intertwined in the world of Stoicism.
That's a fabulous transition that we have some questions that have come in. So I'm going to pause here about halfway through in order to take some of these. So,
Great.
Oh, that's lovely. See, one of the comments is that they came because they think I'm an amazing person, which is really sweet. Somebody else says they came because they love seeing what I want to talk about, and they'll be introspective, continue to grow as a leader. And then we say, what is that book? Was one of them that came in. So the book is actually about using these 12 steps to help make yourself a better product manager, and also to manage your life like a product. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that. And then Juniper. So Shannon was nice enough to send out to folks what it was, the name of the book that she was interested in and influenced by when she was a kid. So I want to talk, Shannon, a little bit more about these things that you can and can't control that you said was so important to you. Is number one, attitude, effort, schedule, and priority. How do you feel about these personally? How do these work in your life?
Yeah, so the way I think about these is that I can control the first two, my attitude and my effort, and I can influence the latter two, which might be a surprise for some people to hear, because this idea there's all this talk right now around taking control of your schedule, not letting your calendar be the boss of you, not letting the asks of others dictate your life. And I think that there's certainly truth to that, and you have to be very conscious of it so you don't just kind of become a victim of other people's needs, and this kind of idea of the importance of being able to say no. But I think that's a little bit dependent on how you see yourself as a leader. So for me, I've been told, and I increasingly recognize that my leadership style is a bit more of the leaders eat last kind of servant leadership model. And so because of that, I really don't have a desire to exert control on others. And I think the best way to have an impact, I suppose, is helping others be successful. So that means that I'm constantly making myself available to my people, no matter what, whenever they need me. That means sometimes I lose control of my schedule. But you know what, Tom? I mean, I've thought about this a lot. That is my choice, right? I
Mhm.
have chosen to loosen the guardrails on my schedule and my priorities, and I've chosen to take that path because I think it's what allows me to help other people grow and ultimately have influence. So I'm comfortable with that. So in some ways I control it because I have chosen to
Mhm.
not have control over it.
Yes,
If that makes sense.
it makes total sense. So my own point of view is that I have to have absolute control over all of these in order to be satisfied, in order to avoid resenting others, in order to be as fulfilled as I desire it to be. I have to have total control over all of them. I surrender, so I make sort of an opposite choice.
Mhm.
I give up my time. I give up my schedule to others, sometimes because it's easier than dealing with myself. So I like to write, and I want to write another book. Writing is hard. And so I do a lot of things to procrastinate and put it off. And I'll take, oh, the dishwasher needs to be emptied. The dog needs to be walked. I work at home, so there's a gazillion distractions. I'll take those things and put them in front of what it is that I really know needs to be done. So I have a good friend who recently sold a business. It was a long process, but they had a successful exit. He's now, for the first time in his life, facing a period where he's not sure what he's going to do next. But when he reflects back, he thinks about a book he read called Hug Your People. And the idea of loving those who you work with, who you're responsible for, I really admire, and it's exhausting. It is so draining to be that kind of a leader. So you said you've made that choice. How do you separate, though, their problems from what needs to be done in the business and from your problems? How do you, like, when I taught ninth grade, I was emotionally exhausted. How do you maintain um, some balance and happiness despite having, people with real problems around you?
Yeah, so I mean, I think there's probably two ways that I go about that. Um, I do identify kind of who are the people that I really want to cultivate and support. And I let them know that I am available to you no matter what at any time. So there's a little bit of a kind of deliberate choice in there. It's not necessarily that I'm just kind of saying, hey, anyone, put any time on my calendar. I don't care. It doesn't matter. But to your point around kind of the separation of the different types of problems. A lot of what I do with these folks is many people are experiencing elements of imposter syndrome. I think we're going to maybe talk about this a little bit more, so I won't get into too much detail, but a lot of what I think I can do is help people recognize what they're actually capable of. What are the things that, again, are within and are not within their control, how they can take the reins on solving problems a little bit more. There's a lot of, when there are problems presented, the whole exercise of, I'm not going to tell you the answer, tell me what you think the answer is, and then kind of working through that and then training people along the way. So that's how I try to keep some separation, but then maybe going back, and this might be kind of super meta, but going back to the very beginning of it around kind of the control element is ultimately I can't control what they are or aren't going to do. So I try not to let a lot of it get too much in my head, or kind of the emotions and challenges that others are experiencing kind of mess with me. I have empathy with it, but I also try to acknowledge all I can do, what I can control is help them get to where they need to be, but the choice is theirs.
Yes. I think that trust and delegation. So it's sort of
Mhm.
there's the phrase trust but verify, which actually means you don't trust.
Yep.
And so to me, it's like
Hmm.
trust and watch.
Yeah.
And I have to understand and see what those what's going to happen, accept what happens, and I can either encourage it and try to influence it, or I can say, this isn't going to work.
Hmm.
So talk to us a little bit about this slide, why we think this is an important fact to understand.
Yeah, this is an interesting one. And there's a lot of research out there to really figure out what is that threshold of financial stability after which the increases in dollars don't lead to the same kind of increases in gains of happiness. And so I think, kind of like most things in life, the connection between money and happiness is relative. It makes a huge difference early on if you don't have any, obviously. But once you get to a certain level, the ability for money to seriously improve your happiness is minimal unless you gain an exponentially large amount, right? So I think, okay, for me, the main thing to take away from this is the idea of almost disconnecting your personal satisfaction from externalities, which you had asked earlier about kind of other tools in Stoicism and Epictetus in particular. And he wrote about this concept of the discipline of assent, ASSENT. And it's this process by which you can keep watch over your thoughts and responses and actions. And what he does is he breaks down every experience or feeling into 3 stages. So first, there's the moment where you perceive an external thing or event. Let's take, you're driving on the highway and a car, slices right in front of you and cuts you off. All right, that's the first thing. 2, we then form this almost unconscious value judgment about this thing or event, essentially kind of an emotion. So, right, in this case, it's anger, rage. Why is this happening? But then the third thing is the most important. We can choose to assent to or agree with that judgment or reject it. I mean, it is our choice about how to respond to and act on that. And so obviously, it's really easy to kind of get caught up in the emotions of something external happening to you, but that is a choice that you are making, or at least it can be if you kind of split this event into 3 pieces. So the reason that I think that that's an interesting way to kind of think about this slide is this discipline of assent involves making correct judgments about the nature of the external world, like the accumulation of money or goods, and then being truly deliberate about what you allow to influence your emotions or your character. So that for me is how I think about this. But yeah, I mean, I'd love your thoughts too.
Oh, that's fabulous. I mean, there's that's actually related to a lot of the principles of recovery. So one of the slogans in recovery is to live and let live. And I've heard people also say, let live and live, so in that is scenario you gave of being cut off, there is an immediate sense of like, why did this happen to me? Why did you do that to me? But you can stop and think, actually, people just do things. They don't do things to me.
Yes.
They do things. So in the case of that person, they probably drive that way all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And you just happen to be on the road at the same time they were. It was, it's obnoxious, but it's nothing personal. And the positive is, no, you weren't hurt. And that person also was not hurt. So it's the choice of how we interpret those events. That's kind of the training. That is the training of your character, is how do you take those externalities and how do you react to them? I can't control my emotional reaction, but I can control what I do next. And so anyway, thank you. I loved how you described that slide.
Yeah, I will say what you spurred one other thought for me, Tom, which is there's this concept. I'm gonna butcher this, I know it, but there's this concept in Buddhism of the question, a saint or someone was asked, what is anger? What is rage? And the response was, it's the punishment we give ourselves for somebody else's mistakes. And I I just love that, right?
Yeah,
Because
yeah.
yeah, like the
Hmm.
experience of anger at someone else's action, you're not
Yeah,
getting back at them. You are just punishing yourself for
yourself.
something that someone else did. I love that.
I love that. That's there's a phrase, free rent in my head.
Yeah,
So somebody's living in my head and I'm giving them free rent.
that's right. That's right.
And so
Yeah,
one guidance I've heard that I love is I'm not going to have conversations with people who aren't there.
I love that. I
Yeah.
love that. That's amazing.
So talk a little bit about how work has changed, and you have a personal experience with this that's really interesting.
Yeah, so I think this is a fascinating chart. I love actually every chart on Our World in Data. Just as a plug, people should just go spend time on that site. It's incredible. It's all interactive. Everything moves. But anyway, I think kind of the interesting takeaway from this one, if you look at how the kind of working hours per week have actually decreased significantly over past decades. So today we in fact have more control over our days than we ever have before. And even if we feel like we are always working because we're always on, in many ways that's not necessarily the case. And the way I think about this is, work expands to the space we allow it to fill, both mentally and from an actual time-based perspective. So you have to be extremely deliberate about how you are spending your time. So the example that I had shared with you is a couple of years ago, I decided to get my executive MBA. So I applied, was accepted to Duke's Fuqua School of Business. And as I started getting ready for that, it began to occur to me, where exactly am I going to find an extra 20 hours a week on top of a very demanding job, my personal life, all of my other interests? And ultimately, while it certainly required sacrifices, I was amazed at the ability to compress work responsibilities by just being extraordinarily focused and not allowing distractions. I think that, in many ways, we feel like our commitments are such a big part of the day because there is a lot of fluff in there and, taking breaks and doing things, and that's fine. But that is a choice. There is also a choice that one can make of being far more deliberate about the use of, not just an hour, but a 10-minute chunk of time to be able to open up other time for other things. And so I think, we really need to recognize that much of this is a choice that we can make.
So let's talk a little bit about responsibility, control, and influence as it relates to an organization. So I'm a product person. Shannon also is very interested in product. This is one way to think about potential responsibilities for a discipline of product management in your organization: strategy, prioritization, market research, etc. So we all have limited energy and limited capacity. And very often, the more things we try to do, the fewer things we do really well. So when you think about your directing your energy and your capacity, what are the things, Shannon, that you think you really need to be responsible for? And then is there anything on this list that you're comfortable having no control over?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I would say I'm responsible currently for strategy, product design, and customer experience, just by sheer virtue of what's on my job description.
Mhm.
But here's the interesting thing. I cannot control any of them, and nor do I want to. So I would far rather, even for the things that I'm responsible for, I'd far rather have influence, because when I think about influence, it's very connected to one of my favorite quotes about, what leadership is. I believe it was Eisenhower, that leadership is the art of getting people to do something that needs to get done, not because I tell them to do it, but because they want to do it, right? Because you're able to give that influence.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, that's kind of how I think about it. And, ultimately there are things on this list that technically I don't have any responsibility or control over, but I just believe that anything that I think is important, I can have the ability to influence. And you just have to approach things in that way for the areas of a business that are meaningful for what you're accountable to.
Yeah, I feel like in a position of authority, you're responsible for all that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So if I'm the chief executive officer or product officer, I have to, but I can't control it. So this is
Hmm.
the paradox of leadership in some ways, is that you have responsibility, but you don't have control.
Yes.
And you do need to get work done through others. So you're trying to find people who are like-minded. You're trying to find people who you can trust, people you admire, people who are better at things than you are.
Hmm.
And then you're trying to create conditions under which they can do fantastic work. And that has a lot to do with giving feedback and encouraging people. Because one of my favorite things to do is to find someone who has an ability that they may have a sense of imposter syndrome about. They may not have as much confidence in as their ability deserves. And then to give that person the confidence, to give them maybe a few extra skills where they begin to see some success. And
Yeah.
so now, to your point, I'm in the influencing column. And I think control is it's a terrible trap, because then we start to think about, how do I control that car never cuts me off again? And so
Hmm.
I'm going to put a dash cam on my car. And the next time somebody cuts me off, I'm going to get their license plate and I'm going to report them to the police, or I'm going to sue them or whatever. And now I'm living for somebody else.
Yeah.
That in my attempt to control my circumstances, I've actually surrendered much of my control. How about other
Yeah.
people, Shannon?
Yeah. So this probably won't be a surprise. But I'm gonna actually lead off with another Marcus Aurelius quote, because I love this one too,
Yeah.
which is this idea of be tolerant with others and strict with yourself. Remember, nothing belongs to you but your flesh and blood, and nothing else is under your control. So that, I mean, it basically supports everything you just talked about, Tom, and probably answers how I think about
That's
this.
right.
You know, I have no control. Well, rather, I would say I cannot control other people's attitudes and other people's efforts and how other people do their work. I can control supplying information that other people need, which goes back to that aspect of kind of servant leadership and influence. And influence, absolutely, all of these. You know, that's the way I think about it. And if anyone ever answers, you know, no control at all, that's a fatalistic answer. You know, there's the ability to influence and make an impact always.
Right. I think that's very important for determining how your team is going to work and what sorts of
Mhm.
people you want in your team. Because there can be teams where it's actually very high performing, even if everyone on that team says, I have no control over your attitude. I'm not going to try to influence it. I'm not going to, no pep talks from me. No, look on the bright side. You're an adult. You're a professional. You can do your thing. If that culture is clearly set and that expectation is there, but there is someone who holds people accountable and says, well, we thought you were going to be able to do this yourself. You haven't been able to do it yourself. So we got to find somebody else. I think it's okay to have a team like that.
Mhm.
It's not I said I see myself as an educator. It's not my natural proclivity, but it doesn't mean it's wrong.
Mhm.
So I do think it's possible to establish that. The one thing for me on this that's non-negotiable is supplying the information other people need. If I have information someone else needs to do their job, it is my responsibility to get them that information. And that is one of the most critical aspects of product management, in my mind, is being the understanding what people need to get to do their job successfully, and then getting them that information.
Yep. I
Same
couldn't
thing
agree
is
more.
now the same thing is true of managing your character. So I'm going to take the example of my own life of recovery. Is that I didn't know by myself I recognized that I had a problem, but I didn't know what I needed to do to overcome that. And so I reached out to people who knew more about it, and they were extraordinarily generous in supplying information to me that I needed to be able to do that job. And they did it by sharing their personal experience, by sharing how they had done it. And that sharing and generosity is present in many communities. I think it's present in the entrepreneurial community. When
Mhm.
you find people who have, or maybe just a little ahead of you on that entrepreneurial journey, and you ask them, how did you do it? I'm behind you. I haven't fixed that problem yet. I think people tend to be very generous.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that, because, say what you will about Silicon Valley now. In the early days of Silicon Valley, if you talk about the earliest entrepreneurs there, that's what made that community so incredibly vibrant, was that everyone was completely open to share and learn and say, these are all the mistakes I made. I've heard a lot of kind of early entrepreneurs in those days talk about this. And I think that that's incredibly powerful and beautiful and important. So I love that.
So let's take a little chance to practice here. We've talked about controlling other people, controlling ourselves. We've talked about how character influences our decisions, influences how we react to externals. This is a chance for us to practice for a second. So I'm going to ask the audience to read this to yourselves. And then I'm going to ask Shannon how she would respond, and we'll talk a little bit about it. So it's going to be silent for about 30 seconds while you all read this to yourself. Okay, Shannon, you've seen this one before. What's your initial reaction? How would you respond to this salesperson?
Yeah. So I mean, I think some of this is all about timing, but in the long game, I'd opt for number three. So
Mhm.
so here's how I think about this. And maybe this is me taking off my philosophical hat a little bit and
Yeah,
just being real about being a product person, which
yeah.
is, a salesperson saying, this is super simple, like it's going to be no big deal, but you're not allowed to talk or represent the product. To me, that feels like a little bit of a recipe for disaster. But I think more generally, telling someone that you need something from them, but that they're not allowed to give kind of feedback or raise issues, that does feel problematic to me, at least in the long term from a relationship perspective.
Yeah, so I think your point about timing is critical. So my choice is to ignore it at this point. Number two, to say we should get on the call. The reason I'm making that choice is that the salesperson is saying, this thing's either going to make my year or get me fired. And I have a call in 5 minutes. So confidence is incredibly important in sales. And also is a projecting that confidence to prospects, making them feel like you're going to lead them to a better way. And it's hard. And sales is also extremely stressful. So to me, the timing to bring up the issue about you just dissed me in a nasty way isn't now. This is a little bit like the car cutting me off. Now, this person knows me, and they cut me off sort of looking in their rear view mirror at me, but it still may not have been about me. And if I do think it's about me, the timing's not right. And so, although it is important that we don't get stepped on and we don't let people step on us. In this case, I would choose to ignore it. But I think both paths can lead to a positive outcome.
Yeah, and it depends kind of almost who you're thinking, having empathy with in that moment. Because your
Yeah.
answer, you're having empathy with the salesperson. My
Mm-hmm.
answer, I'm having preemptive empathy for my product team and all the engineers who are going to have to do a quick fix. That's
Mm-hmm.
not going to be a quick fix, no matter what the
Right.
salesperson says.
Right. Well, if I get a chance to sit in on the call, I might have a chance to steer the outcome.
That's right.
So it's really important to me to understand what the customer actually says in that point of view.
Yep.
Hearing it directly from customers is so much more beneficial than hearing it from a third party. So even in a family dispute, so if my son comes to me and he says, my daughter did something mean, I also need to ask my daughter. And if my other son was involved, I need to ask him his opinion. So I have to collect as many points of view on this as I can. But the best thing is if I actually observe the interaction myself, and I'm not, it's very hard for me to make a judgment if she did something mean or not if I didn't see the interaction. So let's talk a little bit about the sphere of leadership. So I think it's important to understand what your natural ambition is. What sort of sphere do you want to have? So I have a brother-in-law who has a great phrase. He says, I don't want to be a boss and I don't want to have a boss. And so he understands that as an entrepreneur, he is a fantastic starter, but he's not necessarily a fantastic operator. I think about Frederick Douglass, who is an amazing orator and social and writer and statesman, but he didn't have a business. He didn't have a political party that he led. He wasn't at the front of a very large organization, but his impact is enormous. Einstein's another example of an individual contributor with an enormous impact. Marie Curie led a team of researchers, but she didn't lead a foundation. She didn't lead an entire organization or found Pfizer, but she was unbelievably influential, even though she had a small team of people who were working with her on discoveries in radioactivity. Shannon, you've risen in your career and gotten more responsibility as you've gone along. Did you know your natural desire for leadership, for the size of the group that you wanted to work with when you started, or is this something you've discovered as you've gone?
I've discovered it as I've gone, I would say. I've known since fairly early on that I get a tremendous amount of joy and satisfaction by growing other people. I mean, there's nothing in my career I'm more proud of than my ability to hopefully have kind of small pieces of impact on what other people are capable of. So I've known that for a long time. And I think as I've grown, I've realized that being able to take on more, shape organizations, that is actually in many ways a pathway to just growing and supporting and giving opportunities to more and more people. So that's really kind of how I've seen myself evolve in my career.
So it's taken me, enough about me. Do you want to be a CEO?
Someday I do. Someday I mean, I have a passion for entrepreneurship, of starting my own thing. I think I'll get there. Yep.
Yeah. I think that's important to understand. It's like if people have a desire to be a CEO, I think it's very difficult to be happy with anything else. So now to get to that point, to achieve that, you're going to have to do more introspection. You're going to have to do more work understanding what your character is. So this chart shows some of the classic virtues as defined by Aristotle. And the idea in Aristotle's mind was that a virtue is the golden mean between two vices, either too much of something or not enough of something. So for instance, courage is the mean between rashness and cowardice. Rashness, where you have an excess of courage, you can't make rational decisions about risk, and cowardice, where you just really don't make decisions at all. So when I know we've talked a little bit about this in the past, you said this was a difficult exercise for you. Tell me a little bit why this was hard.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's difficult on a couple of fronts. One is maybe just the parsing into these different categories and trying to think about them that way. The other thing is, and this might show that I'm weak in truthfulness, is I tend to probably discount and look through a lot of these things and say, oh, I could be so much better in that area. So I think the exercise in many ways, it's just not something that we're used to doing on an ongoing basis. And so much of it is building the muscle for it. And without the muscle, it is difficult.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that I love that concept of the golden mean, though, that I'm trying to get to the middle of this phenomenon. So like you talked about talking yourself down. So I'd say one of the areas that I need to work on is that I don't necessarily clearly understand my qualities. And I do both boast and talk myself down. And so that's a, this sort of a lifetime journey of understanding what is that character, what is it that I am, and then accepting it, being able to accept both the good and the bad. And I believe this is extremely important for leaders, because if you have something that you're always working around, if there's like a stone in the stream and you're always going around that, other people are going to be affected by that. The people around you, the people who in your organization is going to reflect this distortion. So an example for me is that Mark Zuckerberg never understood and still doesn't understand what Facebook really is. He has an idea in his mind of what it is that he's created, and his idea is totally wrong. Now, he understands that this thing generates an enormous amount of wealth. He's very comfortable with that part of it. But with the destructive elements of what he's built, this concept of being attracted to distortions, being attracted that the impact, distortions and lies and violence, how attractive those things are for interactions, he has never really accepted. And so that distortion affects his company. It affects the reactions of other people who consume his product, and it has incredibly tragic circumstances. So this to me is the work of a lifetime. So what do you think when you see the chart?
Yeah, I mean, so I was reflecting a little bit on what I just touched on, this aspect of truthfulness, and really kind of understanding your virtues and your strengths, and kind of where you maybe overboast or don't build yourself up enough. And it is a very interesting idea in the context of imposter syndrome. So imposter syndrome, probably a lot of folks have heard of that. It's a psychological pattern where one doubts their abilities, feels like a fraud, questions accolades, all of that. And it holds a lot of people back from, feeling capable of taking on new roles, for applying for jobs where maybe, they feel like there's a couple of things on the list that they don't have and certainly aren't qualified for it. So I do think it's a pretty significant problem in our society. I've seen it in a lot of the people that I mentor and work with. And if I'm being totally honest with you, I have struggled with it all of my life. And what helped me get over it in some ways is almost a cognitive reframing mechanism around the idea itself. So I've kind of taught myself now that if I am not experiencing some level of imposter syndrome, it means I'm not pushing myself hard enough. I'm not advancing my skills and my character fast enough. I'm not exposing myself to enough new things and ideas. I'm not learning. So now I've kind of gotten to this strange world where, the experience of imposter syndrome is something I seek. And when I don't have it, I know it's time to move on to the next thing. So I think it's an interesting idea in the context of being truthful about who you are and what you're capable of.
I love that. It's fabulous. So we're starting to bring it home here. We want to talk about how these things affect you as a leader, and also how these things are going to play out in your life. And so you can read this chart either horizontally or vertically. So if we look at virtue looks like in the top left, loving others exactly as they are, even if we hate what they do, love the sinner, hate the sin. I would say that also works for self-reflection. And so it's to your point about imposter syndrome, to that sense of struggling with that, of can we accept that I don't know all the answers, I haven't figured everything out yet, and give ourselves the grace of knowing that we're going to learn by example, by experience. And but we also have if we are managing our character well, if we're developing our virtues, then even when we're in those situations, we don't know what the next right thing to do is, we are more likely to make a positive choice for ourselves and for others. Shannon, is there anything on here that that you've done in your life, that you've seen, that you've tried, or that you're interested in?
Yeah, I love the line, the second from the bottom, the idea of confidence in the face of hardship.
Hmm.
And I think there's an interesting balance that has to be taken here. You don't want to be a Pollyanna about things, but I kind of think of myself as a pragmatic optimist. So I I have a lot of hope, and I see a lot of possibilities and all of the things that we can be doing and what I can do for myself and for others. But you also have to be pragmatic about things, which in many ways it's taking this whole idea of unbounded optimism, and you're putting some slight guardrails around it in the context of going back to stoicism, what you can and cannot control. And so I think there's a very powerful intersection between true optimism and understanding what you can control. And when you harness those things together, I just think the potential is honestly limitless.
So we want to close with a quote from my favorite philosopher, Margaret the Pug. And Margaret says she can think for herself, which is why it saves her the trouble of reading. So you can see behind her there are all of the books that she's had translated into dog. But she doesn't actually need to read any of them, though, because she's thought of all of this stuff by herself. I would encourage you to take a step beyond Margaret. And it is a wonderful thing to think for yourself, but there's a tremendous amount of thinking that has already been done in the world that is vastly better than any thinking I will ever do myself. And to take advantage of that. So I encourage everybody to read. So speaking of reading, I've written a book, and it's called Fortune's Path, 12 Steps to Manage Your Most Important Product, You. And it goes into more depth of many of the things we talked about today. If you're interested in the book, go ahead and you can try these exercises here yourself, or you can just reach out to me at hello@fortunespath.com. And we have contests up there. I haven't created that email address yet, so if you send it, you'll get an error, but I'll create it after the show. And then you can submit these exercises, and we can have a conversation more about it. Or if you want to just reach out, I'm happy to talk to you a little bit more about the book. But we just have a couple of minutes we do have one question that came in here. Oh, it's just a thank you note from to Sherry. Does anybody have any comments or questions or anything that they would like to share with us before in our last few moments? You can also use the Q&A tab there if you like. So I have one final question for Shannon. If you could talk to your 24-year-old self and give her advice, what would you tell her?
I would probably tell her to embrace the imposter syndrome sooner. And have confidence and be able to feel comfortable pushing yourself beyond what you think you should realistically be doing at any point in your career.
That's actually a really interesting answer for Rebecca. So she wrote in and said, what's the best way to get your CEO or manager to recognize your leadership potential? I would say it's to do a lot more than your job description. So think about the job that you want to have in the organization, and then start doing that job. So when I was at HealthStream, I began writing papers about how they needed to become more of a platform as a service rather than just a software as a service. And I never got that job, but they created that job after I left. And they've gone in that direction strategically. So it didn't get me the result that I wanted, but it made the job that the job that I had vastly more interesting, which is basically you have to act as if. The other thing is that being a CEO is extremely lonely. You have no one to talk to who you can really share the truth of your heart. So just developing that relationship where you have to project empathy to them. They are lonely, and they don't want you to come to them with, I want this, I want that, because that's how everybody comes to them. It's more of a, tell me about what you're thinking, and earning that trust, and then showing them that you can be responsive to things that are strategic, that don't have an urgency about them, but that have a long term and are incredibly frustrating because they don't see any progress on those. Shannon, do you have some advice for Rebecca?
You nailed it. Do the job you want to have. Do the job you want to have, and then everything else will follow.
Mark says, you spoke about the difference between the leaders. What about influential leadership? How can someone advance who is more of an influencer than one who is cut out of the executive cloth? I actually think it's much advancing is depends on how you define advancing. Do you mean you want a better title and you want to make more money? Or do you mean you just want to feel better in general, regardless of your title or your money? You can feel better by shining your love light on others and being a positive influence on them, even if it doesn't result in anything related to salary or prestige or anything like that. That's actually the best, most important advancement you can have. If it's about salary, you're going to have to tie whatever it is, that influence that you're doing, back to a positive impact on the business. Shannon, do you have any comments from Mark?
Yeah, I think that, when you're more of an influential leader, you actually in many ways get kind of pushed from the bottom and sides up into leadership, because you have built such trust and influence with so many people that they're going to kind of move you up in many ways. So I think just kind of embrace that process. It's actually probably the best kind of leader there is to be.
Kaylin asks, what would be the number one skill to build to get into product management? I think the superpower for product management is empathy. And I also think I'm an educator, so I think being persuasion and education are important. Shannon, how about you?
I think it's curiosity. I think it's curiosity about the people around you, about the audiences, the customers you're trying to serve, the business models that are possible, and never being satisfied with the status quo or how things are right now.
And so I'd say that there are multiple models of thinking about product management. The two primary ones that I think about are the generalist or the liberal arts major like myself. And then there are much more technical, specialized product managers in the world who may have a computer science background or who may have a marketing background. None of these are wrong. I think of product management as being more important from the standpoint of a discipline rather than a title. And that discipline is focused around getting customers what they want, even when they can't tell you what they want. Mm-hmm. So Aaron says, Shannon, your power of influence is huge, much bigger than the role you have. What's your number one secret if you had to select one?
Oh dear. I don't know that I have any secrets other than I love life. And so I think that just being able to enjoy and experience all of the opportunities on a daily basis and not be kind of taken down a peg. Maybe it comes back to the optimism, but trying to be pragmatic. That in many ways is probably what just helps me keep moving forward.
Yeah, I would say as someone who knows you, you project a truthfulness and you project an enthusiasm, which is very influential, very infectious. Well, thanks, folks. I really appreciate everybody who joined us today. We will be sending the slides out, and we'll also there'll be a recording of this that we'll post. And enjoy your Friday. Thank you, Shannon. It was wonderful spending time with you.
It's always fun. Thank you, Tom.